Here's the bottom line. If economist Richard Wolff is saying the game is over in the context of the war in Iran, he's not talking about one missile strike, one battle, or one political speech. He's talking about a larger system under extreme pressure. A system where war, energy, shipping, inflation, markets, and global power are now colliding at the same time. And when you put the rhetoric aside and look at what your sources actually confirm, it becomes clear why that phrase hits so hard. Start with the basic picture. This is no longer just a regional flare-up. Multiple major outlets describe a conflict with consequences, spreading far beyond the battlefield. Reuters reports that the wider war involving Iran has put additional strain on the Gaza ceasefire and coincided with repeated deadly incidents there. AP says the war in Iran is now sparking a global fertilizer shortage and threatening food prices. Bloomberg says oil has climbed as the conflict drags on, with markets reacting to tension around the Strait of Hormuz. Al Jazeera's live tracker says preliminary figures put the death toll at 1,937 in Iran, at least 19 in Israel, 13 U.S. soldiers, and 25 killed in Gulf states. Even allowing for the fact that live tallies can change, that is already a staggering sign of regional scale. So when Wolff frames this as something bigger than a single war story, that interpretation lines up with the broader evidence. The conflict is not only about territory or retaliation. It is also about whether the old assumptions behind globalization, energy stability, and US-led regional order still work the way they used to. Let's break that down carefully. The first pillar is energy. Bloomberg's coverage repeatedly highlights how central the Strait of Hormuz has become. One Bloomberg item notes that 2 Chinese container ships attempted to exit Hormuz before turning back. Another reports traders bracing for the impact of prolonged war, with one bank warning oil could reach $200 if the conflict lasts into June. Bloomberg also says U.S. diesel rose above $5 a gallon for the first time since December 2022, describing it as another sign of fuel price pressure threatening the global economy. AP similarly reports that stocks fell and oil rose after the latest delay in diplomacy failed to reassure markets. That matters, because Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. If traffic through it becomes unreliable, the effect spreads fast. Fuel prices jump, shipping costs rise, insurance costs go up. Central banks start worrying about inflation. Import-dependent countries get squeezed. Poorer countries can face shortages more quickly than wealthier ones. AP's reporting on fertilizer shortages makes the point even sharper. Fertilizer is deeply connected to natural gas and global shipping. So disruption in one strategic corridor can feed into food production and food prices far from the Gulf. This is where a figure like Wolff would likely see a deeper structural problem. A system built on globally synchronized supply chains can look efficient in peacetime. But in wartime, efficiency can become fragility. When one choke point becomes unstable, entire sectors start wobbling. Energy markets wobble, agriculture wobbles, manufacturing wobbles, shipping wobbles, finance wobbles. The war becomes more than a military crisis. It becomes a stress test for the whole model. Now look at the military side, because your sources also show that this is not a narrow or symbolic confrontation. U.S. Central Command says U.S. forces launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026. CENTCOM imagery and releases show the USS Abraham Lincoln operating in support of that mission on March 3rd. The USS Gerald R. Ford transited the Suez Canal on March 5th. Guided missile destroyers, including USS Bainbridge and USS Delbert D. Black, were also shown moving through the region. CENTCOM additionally released imagery of B-52H bombers preparing to launch in support of Operation Epic Fury on March 4th. It also issued warnings to civilians to avoid ports used by Iranian forces and issued safety warnings to civilians in Iran. That is an unmistakable sign of a high-intensity posture. It does not automatically tell us what Washington will do next. But it does show that the United States has assembled visible military options across air and sea. Add to that the March 12 KC-135 loss in Iraq, with CENTCOM later confirming all crew members deceased, and it is obvious this is not a low-risk environment. Officially confirmed U.S. losses matter because they demonstrate that, even in a posture built around deterrence and regional projection, real danger is already present. Now place that military buildup next to the political and diplomatic side. AP reports that G7 foreign ministers were meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, trying to sell U.S. strategy to skeptical allies. Bloomberg reports some Republicans are raising questions about Iran war plans. Reuters says the Gaza ceasefire has been under serious strain since the United States and Israel began bombing Iran. This is a key point for a Wolff-style analysis. When war expands faster than diplomacy, markets and institutions can absorb, the crisis stops being tactical and becomes systemic. In other words, the game he refers to may be the old assumption that major powers can impose order, contain fallout, and keep the economic machine running at the same time. Right now, that assumption looks shaky, and the market signals support that conclusion. Bloomberg says the NASDAQ 100 fell into correction territory as U.S. stocks slid while oil climbed. Another Bloomberg line says Treasury yields reached the year's highs as the Iran stalemate lifted oil. It also reports economists seeing war pushing U.S. inflation above 3% and hurting growth. Europe is not immune either. Bloomberg says the EU sees risk of a stagflation shock from the Iran war. And ECB policymaker Pierre Wunsch said a rate hike would likely be needed if the conflict was not over by June. That is the kind of domino effect Wolff would likely emphasize. A war in one region does not stay contained when it hits fuel, shipping, and inflation expectations. It starts reshaping monetary policy and investor behavior in entirely different continents. AP reinforces the same pattern from a different angle. It says Southeast Asia is revisiting nuclear power plans for AI data centers as the Iran war disrupts energy supplies. It reports that the war is threatening food prices through fertilizer disruption. It describes Iran as formalizing a chokehold on Hormuz with a toll booth regime. And it notes analysis suggesting Iran is using insurgent tactics while holding the world economy hostage 1 month into the war. You can disagree with the phrasing, but the scale of concern is undeniable. That brings us to the phrase, "the game is over." Interpreted carefully and responsibly, it does not have to mean civilization is ending or that collapse is guaranteed. A safer, more evidence-based reading is that the old game, cheap energy, predictable shipping, manageable inflation, and the assumption that regional wars can be compartmentalized, is breaking down. Not necessarily forever, but enough that policymakers, investors, and the public can no longer pretend this is business as usual. Reuters offers more evidence of that broader unraveling by showing how this war is interacting with other already unstable fronts. It reports Israeli strikes killing civilians in Gaza even under a ceasefire framework brokered months earlier. It says the war with Iran is straining Gaza peace efforts. It reports the UN saying more than 36,000 Palestinians have been displaced by settlement expansion and associated violence in the West Bank over a year. It also reports that an Iranian missile attack in the West Bank killed 3 Palestinian women on March 18th, described as the first deadly Iranian strike there and the first to kill Palestinians since the start of the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. These details matter because they show that regional compartment lines are dissolving. What happens in one theater is now shaping others. For a political economist like Wolff, that's crucial. Systems under stress rarely break in one place only. They reveal hidden interdependence. A war with Iran affects Gaza. Gaza affects diplomacy. Diplomacy affects oil. Oil affects inflation. Inflation affects elections and central banks. Central banks affect jobs and growth. The war is no longer over there. It loops back into domestic politics in Washington, Europe, and beyond. You can already see this in the U.S. political response. AP notes splits among conservatives over U.S. president's war in Iran. Bloomberg points to Republicans raising questions about war plans. The New York financial lens is also visible everywhere in the Bloomberg material. Oil, shipping, inflation, rates, corrections, and supply chain anxiety. When an external conflict begins to shape internal political fractures and domestic cost of living fears, the war becomes part of the home front economy. That is exactly the territory where Wolff's commentary typically resonates most. Another angle that fits the title is the credibility problem. Governments often try to project confidence in wartime, but markets and supply chains are less interested in speeches than in practical outcomes. If Hormuz becomes unreliable, if energy costs remain elevated, if military operations continue without a clear diplomatic off-ramp, then official reassurances start losing force. Bloomberg's repeated market stories imply that investors are not treating this as a quickly containable event. AP's reporting on food and fertilizer suggests humanitarian and economic knock-on effects are already real. Al Jazeera's casualty tracker, while preliminary and dynamic, underscores that the human cost is not marginal. At the same time, it is important to stay factual and measured. Your sources do not prove that any one camp's grand theory is fully correct. They do not confirm that the global economic order has permanently collapsed. They do not prove any final military outcome in Iran. And they do not justify sensational claims that go beyond the evidence. What they do support is a much narrower but still powerful conclusion. The war is exposing major vulnerabilities in the systems that connect military power, energy flows, global trade, and domestic economic stability. That alone is enough to sustain Wolff's core warning. Look again at the specific numbers and markers your sources provide. Reuters says more than 36,000 Palestinians were displaced in the West Bank over a year by settlement expansion and related violence. AP says Iran's war impact is now threatening global fertilizer supply. Bloomberg says U.S. diesel rose above $5 a gallon for the first time since December 2022. Bloomberg also says the NASDAQ 100 fell into correction territory. Al Jazeera's preliminary live tracker lists 1,937 dead in Iran, at least 19 in Israel, 13 U.S. soldiers, and 25 killed in Gulf states. CENTCOM confirms the launch of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, and confirms the loss of a KC-135 and all crew aboard in Iraq on March 13th. Those are not abstract signals. They are concrete indicators of widening human, strategic, and economic damage. What makes this especially significant is that no single institution appears fully in control of the consequences. The military can deploy carriers and bombers, but it cannot by itself lower food prices or restore investor confidence. Central banks can react to inflation, but they cannot reopen a threatened choke point. Diplomats can try to manage escalation, but they cannot instantly erase the political pressures created by casualties and rising costs. That fragmentation of control is exactly the kind of thing that makes systemic crises feel bigger than their immediate causes. There is also the question of narrative. In many conflicts, governments try to frame events in simple moral or strategic terms. One side is winning, one side is losing, one operation succeeded, one red line was enforced. But economic crises are harder to narrate cleanly because their damage spreads through ordinary life. A higher fuel bill, more expensive food, delayed shipping, market losses, rate hikes, slower growth. Wolff's language often cuts through official narratives by asking, who pays, who profits, who absorbs the damage? Based on your sources, the answer seems broad. Civilians in war zones pay first and most directly, but consumers, workers, and import-dependent economies are being drawn in too. To keep this policy safe and fact-based, it is also worth saying plainly, analyzing the economic and geopolitical effects of war is not the same thing as endorsing violence. This script is about understanding consequences, not glorifying them, and the consequences described in your sources are severe enough without any exaggeration. So, if we were to summarize the strongest possible factual reading of The Game is Over, it would be this. The old assumption that a major Middle East war could remain geographically contained while the global economy carried on more or less normally is no longer credible. The evidence in your sources points instead to a conflict that is hitting shipping lanes, energy prices, food supply chains, financial markets, diplomacy, and domestic politics all at once. That doesn't mean there is no path back from the brink. It does mean the cost of miscalculation is now much higher, and that may be the most important insight of all. The war in Iran is not only a test of missiles, air defenses, or military alliances. It is a test of whether the world's economic and political architecture can handle concentrated stress in one of its most sensitive regions. So far, the answer looks uncertain. The oil market is rattled, shipping is cautious, allies are uneasy, ceasefires elsewhere are under strain, civilian casualties are mounting. And leaders are still speaking as if time is abundant. It isn't. If Wolff says the game is over, the evidence does not require us to agree with every conclusion he might draw, but it does justify taking the warning seriously, because what your sources show is not a clean, containable conflict. They show a war that is bleeding into the structure of the global economy itself. And when that happens, the real question is no longer who won the latest exchange. The real question is what kind of world emerges after the illusion of stability finally breaks.